The laughter was sharp and merciless. Naomi Johnson stood in the center of the ballroom with her head bowed, fingers curled tight around the edge of her apron as if the fabric could shield her from 1,000 eyes. The chandeliers blazed with cold light above her, catching on every jewel, every champagne flute, every amused smirk tilted in her direction. The string quartet fell quiet mid-phrase. The entire room pivoted toward the same scene, one black maid, one mistake, one crowd hungry for something to talk about. A glistening ribbon of champagne crawled across the marble floor where the tray had slipped from her hand. Crystal shards glittered like frost around her shoes. "Look at me," said Alexander Cordes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The billionaire moved through the circle of guests like a closing door, tuxedo sharp, shoulders square, a folded program in one hand. The way people shifted when he approached, men straightening, women tilting their chins, told Naomi everything about where power lived in this room. She looked up, just enough to meet his gaze. Alexander let the moment stretch, turning his head so the room could watch his displeasure. "This is my house tonight," he said, voice smooth as steel. "Do you know how much a single flute costs? Do you know what it means when you waste my time and money?" Naomi swallowed. "I'm sorry, sir." From his arm, Isabella Duarte's soft laugh curved like a knife. Scarlet silk clung to her in a way that guaranteed attention. So did the three women at her shoulders, all in the same blood-red glow of fabric and lipstick, a little army of approval. "Sorry." Isabella's brows arched, amused. "Sorry doesn't wipe champagne off marble, does it?" She glanced at the faces circling them. "Honestly, Alexander, you reward loyalty and competence, not clumsiness." "Fire her," one of the women in red said brightly, as if requesting a favorite song. "Do it properly. Make an example." The head waiter, a compact man with a silver streak through his hair, took a careful step forward. "Sir, if I may." "You may not," Alexander said, not bothering to look at him. The waiter froze, then faded backward into the wall like a ghost. Naomi bent, meaning to gather the larger shards with her hands. The marble was cold against her knees. She caught her reflection in the polished floor, uniform clean, collar straight, face steady, but her hands shook regardless. "Don't move," Alexander said. She went still. "Let them look," Isabella purred, voice pitched to travel. "Let them see what happens when standards slip." One of her friends hid a grin behind the rim of her flute. Another whispered something into her ear. Both of them laughed. The sound spread, light at first, then louder, until the ballroom silence had a new texture, the hum of people enjoying themselves at someone else's expense. Alexander tilted his head, measuring Naomi like a misdelivered package. Then he lifted the folded program and tapped it against his palm. "Do you know why people are here?" he asked. "Because they trust me to host a perfect night. Because I control 1,000 details they never see. When one thing breaks, it reminds them that perfection can be interrupted." He made a small, dismissive motion toward the puddle at her feet. "By anyone." Naomi didn't look away. "I'll pay for the glasses," she said carefully. "From my wages. However long it takes." Another laugh, sharper this time. "Isabella. Darling, that could be your entire salary for a year." She leaned closer to Alexander without taking her eyes off Naomi. "Honestly, do we really have to endure this? It's your 50th. "She's right," one of Isabella's friends said. "You deserve better scenery." Alexander lifted a hand and the women fell silent on instinct. He stepped closer until Naomi could see the faint sheen of sweat at his temple, the precise line of his jaw. When he spoke, his voice carried effortlessly. "Stand up." Naomi rose. The circle tightened. "What's your name?" he asked. "Naomi, sir." "Naomi." He tested the syllables, then smiled with only half his mouth. "How long have you worked here?" 5 years. 5 years, he repeated, letting the room absorb it. "And in 5 years, you've learned how to vanish. Useful. Tonight you chose not to. Less useful." Isabella's pearls flashed as she laughed again. "She didn't choose anything, Alex. Gravity did." Naomi felt heat creep up her neck but kept her voice steady. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Alexander considered her. Mistakes reveal people, he said. Sometimes better than success does. He shifted his program to his other hand, then lifted his glass, still full, and turned in a slow arc so he could include the audience. Fortunately, he went on, I am a generous man. Generous men forgive. But they also entertain. A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. Somewhere in the corner, a camera phone rose and hovered. Alexander faced the DJ tucked behind a grand floral arrangement. Stop the playlist. The string quartet lowered their bows. The murmur deepened. He looked back at Naomi. Tell me, he said, do you dance? Isabella actually clapped a hand to her mouth, delighted. Oh, Alex. No. Naomi blinked. Sir? Do you dance? He repeated, smiling now. Or is walking the only choreography you've mastered? The laugh line went around the room again, neat as a rehearsed waltz. Naomi felt it land and pass through her. Her hands were steady now. Something in her chest quieted. I clean, she said. That's my job. Cleaners can have hobbies, Isabella said lightly. Knitting? Karaoke? Break dancing, one of the red dresses murmured. She's got the breaking part down. Alexander lifted 2 fingers and the women settled, like well-trained birds. He studied Naomi a moment longer, then set his untouched champagne on a passing tray. Move the tables, he said. Make space. Staff sprang forward. Chairs scraped. The marble revealed a wide, gleaming square. Guests stepped back to the perimeter, faces bright with curiosity. The ring closed in tighter, like theater in the round. Naomi stayed where she was. Good, Alexander said. Now I have your attention. He turned to the DJ. Do you know Por una cabeza? The DJ nodded, bewildered, hand hovering over the controls. Not yet, Alexander said. He took a step toward Naomi. Before we go any further, Naomi, may I call you Naomi? Understand this. I could ask security to escort you out. I could cut your wages to cover damages. I could make a few calls and make sure you never work at a hall like this again. He let the words settle. Or I could give you a different option. Naomi's throat felt dry. What option? Isabella leaned in, eyes bright. Oh, this will be good. Alexander lifted his program as if he were about to read from it, then seemed to change his mind. He folded it again, tucked it into his jacket, and gave Naomi the full weight of his attention. Show me something worthy of the silence you caused. He gestured toward the polished square of floor. Dance, he said simply. A small, audible intake of breath came from the crowd. The quartet glanced at one another. Naomi didn't move. Isabella's smile widened. He's being kind, she said, addressing the circle, not Naomi. He's giving her a way to leave without being fired. She'll refuse, of course. She'll cry. Do you dance? Alexander asked again, ignoring Isabella. Yes or no? Naomi lifted her head. Her eyes were not angry. They were clear, and there was something in them no one in the room expected to find. Something that made a few people in the front row shift, uneasy, as if they'd misread the scene entirely. Why? She asked. Alexander seemed pleased by the question. Because you turned my party into a stage, he said. I'm simply deciding what the performance will be. He inclined his head toward the DJ. Now. The first 3 notes of the tango slipped into the air like a match being struck, low, dangerous, impossible to ignore. The chandeliers didn't dim, but the room felt darker anyway. The ring tightened. Even Isabella's friends fell quiet, breath catching as the music drew a clean line through the chatter. Naomi stood at the edge of that line, still as marble. Alexander's voice dropped, just enough for her to hear. If you can't, say so. Walk away, and I'll let the head waiter settle the rest with you privately. Naomi's gaze flicked, just once, to the red dresses clustered at Isabella's shoulder. Their smiles waited for her to fold, to apologize again, to become small enough to forget. She took 1 step forward. Isabella's smile faltered. Naomi stopped a pace from the center of the floor, palms open at her sides, shoulders square. The cut on her finger had stopped bleeding. Her breathing evened out. Somewhere beyond the circle, the head waiter stood with his hands clasped, eyes fixed on her like a prayer. Alexander watched her without blinking. The violin slid into the melody's first sweep. Naomi raised her chin. The ballroom held its breath. And then, before a single foot moved, Alexander lifted his hand, and the music snapped off like a light. "Not yet," he said, softly enough that only the nearest guests heard, but the words rippled outward anyway. He looked past Naomi, to the ring of red and silver and hungry eyes, and then back at her. "Do you dance?" he asked a third time. Naomi met his gaze without flinching. "Ask me on music," she said. For the first time all night, Alexander smiled with his whole mouth. He turned his wrist. The DJ's finger fell. The opening bars of Por una cabeza cut the room clean in two. And the chapter ended with Naomi standing inside the circle, the sound of tango coiling around her like a dare. The first notes of the tango lingered in the air, sharp and sultry, yet every guest was focused not on the music, but on the woman standing stiffly in the center of the marble floor. Naomi Johnson, the maid, her black and white uniform stained with champagne, looked as though she had been dragged into the spotlight against her will. Around her, the crowd began to buzz again, soft whispers, cruel chuckles, the sound of predators circling. "This is absurd," Isabella Duarte laughed, her voice slicing through the tension. She clutched Alexander's arm possessively, the crimson silk of her gown shimmering beneath the chandeliers. "Darling, you can't be serious. She's a maid. What does she know about tango?" One of her friends leaned close, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She probably learned to dance sweeping floors." The ring of women in red erupted in laughter, high-pitched and merciless. Naomi's face burned, but she didn't move. Her chin was raised now, even as her hands remained clenched at her sides. She could feel hundreds of eyes drilling into her, businessmen smirking into their glasses, politicians whispering to their wives, women sneering behind jeweled fans. Every one of them expected her to falter. Alexander's gaze, however, never left her. He paced slowly at the edge of the dance floor, savoring the spectacle like a king surveying his court. "You're right, Isabella," he said at last, his smile cruel. "It is absurd. But that's the point, isn't it? Entertainment. A little wager to keep the evening lively." He raised his voice, projecting to the crowd. "If this maid dances better than my fiancée, I'll marry her instead." The ballroom exploded in laughter. Some clapped their hands as if he'd told a joke, others whistled, egging him on. A handful of older guests exchanged uneasy looks, but no one dared to speak against him. Naomi's heart thudded in her chest. The words echoed in her mind like thunder, "Marry her instead." She knew it was mockery, a cruel game meant to crush her dignity. But the weight of it, said in front of Sao Paulo's most powerful, made her tremble. Isabella pressed a manicured hand against her chest as though scandalized, but her smile was vicious. "Alexander, darling, don't be ridiculous. Do you really think anyone here believes she could outdance me?" "Of course not," one of her friends chimed in. "But imagine how amusing it will be when she tries." Another leaned forward, her diamonds flashing. "She'll trip on her own shoes before the second step." The women laughed again, their mockery echoing across the marble. Naomi's fists tightened. She wanted to vanish, to escape the circle of jeering faces, but she couldn't. Not anymore. Alexander stopped pacing and turned back to Naomi. "Well, do you accept, maid? Or will you crawl back into the shadows where you belong?" The crowd hushed instantly, leaning in for her response. Naomi drew a shaky breath. Her voice came out low, but clear enough to carry. "I accept." Gasps rippled through the room. Isabella's eyes widened in disbelief before she burst into uncontrollable laughter. "She accepts? Oh, this will be delicious." "You?" one of the women sneered. "In that uniform? On this floor?" "She doesn't even have shoes fit for dancing," another said. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. "I accept," she repeated, louder this time. Alexander raised a brow. He hadn't expected her defiance. "On one condition?" he asked, mocking her earlier boldness. Naomi met his eyes steadily. Just, if I win, you keep your word. No excuses. You marry me. The laughter returned, louder than before, shaking the chandeliers. Some guests nearly doubled over, clutching their stomachs. Isabella was laughing so hard tears threatened to ruin her mascara. You hear that? She gasped between giggles. She actually believes she stands a chance. Oh, Alexander, this is priceless. But Alexander didn't laugh this time. His eyes narrowed slightly, searching Naomi's face for something he couldn't quite name. There was no desperation in her voice. No plea for mercy. Only resolve. He turned to the crowd and gave a dramatic shrug. Very well. You heard her. If she wins, I will honor my word. Impossible. Isabella spat, her laughter drying instantly. You can't. Are you afraid, Isabella? Alexander cut her off smoothly. His words carried enough weight to hush even her. For the first time that evening, Isabella faltered. She straightened, adjusting the strap of her gown, and lifted her chin. Afraid? Of her? Don't be absurd. She turned to the guests, regaining her confidence. If this maid wants to humiliate herself, I'll happily show her what true elegance looks like. The crowd applauded, cheering Isabella on as she stepped gracefully into the center of the floor. The women in red clapped and whistled, chanting her name like she was about to win a trophy. Naomi stood opposite her, motionless. Her uniform looked plain against Isabella's glittering gown, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire no one could ignore. The DJ, nervous but obedient, cued the track again. The first haunting notes of Por una cabeza filled the hall, a melody of passion and danger. Alexander raised his glass, his smirk returning. Let the dance begin. The crowd erupted in cheers. Isabella curtsied dramatically, soaking in the attention, then shot Naomi a sneer. This is my world, she whispered venomously. You don't belong here. Naomi didn't answer. She simply steadied her breath. The music swelled. Isabella took the first step. The music surged, violins weaving sharp and urgent notes through the ballroom. All eyes fixed on Isabella Duarte as she glided to the center of the polished marble, her scarlet gown trailing behind like fire. She stretched one arm high, the other pressed to her hip, and struck a pose before the first beat even landed. The crowd applauded immediately. Not for the pose itself, it was awkward, stiff, but because Isabella looked every inch the glittering fiancée of a billionaire. To them, that was enough. Brava! One guest shouted, already raising his glass. Naomi stood at the edge of the circle, her hands clasped tight before her, watching. She had expected arrogance. She hadn't expected the audience to cheer this loudly for so little. Isabella began to move. She swayed her hips in exaggerated rhythm, the hem of her gown sweeping dramatically. Her steps were deliberate, showy, designed to draw attention to the curves of her body rather than the music. She snapped her head from side to side, tossing her dark hair, her lips fixed in a sultry pout. The men in the front row clapped, some whistling, clearly entertained. But Naomi could see the flaws instantly. The steps were sloppy, the timing a fraction off. Isabella walked the floor as though it were a runway, not a stage for tango. Still, the crowd ate it up. She's divine, one woman whispered to her husband, who nodded dutifully, though his eyes lingered on Naomi for a second before darting away. Alexander Cortez leaned back against a table, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The faintest curve of amusement tugged at his mouth. Isabella continued, her movements growing bolder. She twirled once, twice, almost losing her balance on the second spin but catching herself quickly. She laughed as if it were part of the act, raising her arms high. The audience clapped louder, mistaking her recovery for flair. Look at her confidence, one of Isabella's friends in red said proudly. That maid doesn't stand a chance. Naomi's nails pressed into her palms. Confidence was easy when the crowd was yours before you began. The violins reached a sharper peak, and Isabella attempted a series of forward ochos, twisting her hips to mimic the sensual lines of tango. To anyone unfamiliar, it might have looked impressive. But to Naomi, who had lived and breathed dance long before she became invisible, it was painful to watch. Isabella's feet dragged, her posture broke, her timing stumbled. She was relying not on rhythm, but on applause. And applause she received. Men whistled. Women clapped politely. Cameras flashed as though documenting a performance of true art, not of hollow mimicry. Isabella basked in it, her smile wide, her eyes darting toward Naomi with each exaggerated step. "Still want to try, Maid?" she mouthed once, her painted lips curling cruelly. Naomi said nothing. She didn't lower her gaze either. She stood tall, watching every movement, every mistake, every shallow attempt at grace. The music built toward its crescendo. Isabella strutted to the center, lifted her arms again, and posed with her head thrown back, gown swirling dramatically around her legs. The crowd erupted in cheers, the kind reserved for celebrities and queens. Guests rose from their chairs, clapping loudly. Some shouted her name. Others whistled. Glasses clinked, heels tapped, the ballroom bursting with approval. Isabella curtsied deeply, her laughter carrying above the applause. She blew a kiss to Alexander, who lifted his glass in lazy acknowledgement. Then she turned, eyes locking on Naomi. "Your turn, Maid," she said, her voice dripping with mockery though the crowd was still clapping. "Try not to embarrass yourself too much. It would be tragic to waste such a fine song." The laughter returned, sharp and cruel. The women in red covered their mouths, giggling as though Naomi had already failed. Naomi took a step forward. The laughter dimmed, replaced by whispers. She looked small compared to Isabella in her dazzling gown, plain uniform, worn shoes, apron stained. But her back was straight, her breathing even, her eyes unflinching. She glanced once at the polished floor beneath her feet. The same marble she had scrubbed, mopped, polished in silence for years. Tonight it was hers. The DJ looked uncertain, waiting for Alexander's signal. Alexander tilted his glass toward Naomi. "The stage is yours," he said, voice heavy with amusement. The crowd murmured, some leaning forward, others readying their cameras again. Naomi inhaled deeply, closing her eyes just as the violins swelled once more. The ballroom held its breath. She opened her eyes and stepped into the circle. The DJ hovered, waiting. Cameras glowed along the rim of the circle. Naomi stood on the marble with the room pressing in, 1,000 breaths held at once. She lifted a hand to the DJ. "From the top, please." A few guests laughed under their breath at her nerve. The first bars of Por una cabeza returned, bandoneon, strings, the steady pulse that drives the floor to life. Naomi's weight shifted to the ball of her left foot. Her right traced a clean back step, heel whispering past the floor. She did not chase the rhythm. She let it come to her. Her torso stayed calm. Her legs drew precise lines. A slow pivot turned her toward the room, chin lifted, shoulders stacked over her axis. The chuckles died. People leaned in. She crossed sharp into a salida, flicked a tight bolio that cut the air and returned without wobble, then settled into a series of forward ochos that matched the phrase exactly. The hem of her plain skirt barely stirred. Each change of direction arrived on the violin's breath, not a beat before, not a beat after. Someone near the front whispered, "That's clean." On the far side, Isabella folded her arms. "Anyone can practice a few tricks," she said, loud enough for the red dresses to hear. "She's memorized a routine." Naomi didn't look at her. She drew a light adorno with the inside edge of her foot, then carved a diagonal like a blade. No toss of hair, no pantomime. The drama came from the music and the accuracy of her choices. She paused on half count, emptying the space so the phrase could land, then took the audience again in a single collected step. A man in a tux whispered, "She's on the axis." His date nodded without taking her eyes off the floor. The melody surged. Naomi answered with a weight change so subtle you could miss it if you blinked, then slid into a barida, an invisible partner implied in the sweep of her instep, before cutting away into a quick, low gancho that snapped and released. Gasps rolled across the circle, soft but unmistakable. Alexander Kortz had not moved from his place at the edge, arms folded, glass forgotten. His gaze followed the economy of her shoulders, the way her sternum tracked the phrase, the refusal to waste motion. Familiarity tugged at the back of his mind. Shapes he had once tried to learn, corrections he had once heard in a studio with mirrors and scuffed wood. He didn't remember the words. He remembered their result. Naomi pivoted into back ochos, traveled the long side of the floor with stride that ate the marble but never broke frame, then stopped dead on the bandoneon's sigh. No flourish. Just stillness that held. Silence thickened. The chandeliers hummed. A silver-haired woman near the front wiped the corner of her eye. "She's breathing with the music," she murmured. The violins climbed. Naomi did not chase them. She stepped underneath, a soft cross that set up the turn, then a tight Molinite sequence around the center of her body, feet whispering, hips quiet. The turn ended exactly on the phrase's crest. She dropped 1 degree lower through her knee and let the accent hit through her torso like a heartbeat. Cameras forgot to click. Isabella tried again. "She's doing tricks," she said, but the words slid off the marble. No one laughed. Naomi allowed herself one glance around the ring, never breaking posture, never losing weight, taking the room in as if measuring its distance, then returned her eyes to the invisible partner she had carried in her chest since the first note. The next passage asked for heat. She gave it without show, a decisive step, a grounded pivot, a crisp lapese that drew a small circle against the floor like an oath. A young woman in red said under her breath, "That's not YouTube." Her friend nodded once, stunned. The bandoneon dipped to a minor turn. Naomi answered by making the space even smaller, compressing the phrase into the triangle of her feet. She placed a parada no one could see and caressed past it, a ghost of contact that read as dialogue with the air. The room exhaled as one. At the chorus, she opened her chest to the chandeliers. Not a pose. An arrival. The uniform looked like a costume now because the body wearing it had decided what the scene was. She sent one final bolio, clean as glass, then drew it in without noise and let the melody settle her feet side by side. The quartet of red dresses stood without knowing they had. Isabella's hands, still crossed, pressed a little harder against her ribs. Alexander's fingers flexed against his sleeve. The steps troubled something old and unused in him. He watched the angle of Naomi's head in the hold she never took, the way she finished each phrase as if closing a door without sound. A glint at her collar caught light as she turned, a small flash of gold against white. He frowned before he could stop himself, but the music pulled him forward again. Naomi moved through the penultimate section with no hurry. She yielded weight to the downbeat, carved a path, listened for the silence between two notes and stood there long enough to make the room aware of its own pulse. Guests who had come to be entertained found themselves disciplined instead, held by the timing of someone who refused to beg for their approval. A man near the back whispered, "Where did she learn?" No one answered. The final climb arrived. Naomi measured it like a craftsman, 3 counts to set, 2 to turn, 1 to land. The violin screamed for theater. She denied it, choosing control. A final turn closed around her own axis. A last step crossed and locked, her chin lifted to neutral. The bandoneon died. Silence. Not the shocked silence of broken glass. Not the hungry silence before a joke. A silence that recognized you could not speak over this and keep your dignity. It held for a full second. Then 2. Then 3. A single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined. Then a third. The sound grew like surf, rolling around the circle until the ballroom was on its feet. Some shouted without words. Others simply stood with wet eyes and palms that refused to stop. Naomi did not bow like a supplicant. She inclined her head once, a professional acknowledgement of an audience that had finally learned to listen. Her breathing was steady. The cut on her finger no longer bled. Isabella forced a laugh that broke half-born in her throat. "She rehearsed," she said to no one, then louder, "She rehearsed. This is staged." The words fell flat. The women beside her clapped with everyone else, not daring to be the last to stand. Alexander did not applaud at first. He stared at Naomi as if sight alone could solve a puzzle words could not reach. Then he brought his hands together once, twice, 3 times, and the sound drew a small change across his face, less a smile than the idea of one. The head waiter blinked hard and coughed into his fist. The DJ swallowed and looked at the controls, as if the machine might ask him what to feel. Naomi stepped back from the center. The circle loosened and then refused to, unwilling to let the moment end. As she moved, the gold at her collar flashed again. A tiny locket tucked beneath the fold of her uniform, quick as a memory. Alexander's eyes caught it this time and held. Something like heat slid through his chest and was gone before he could name it. A woman near the front called out, "Where did you learn?" Another voice, trembling, "Who are you?" Naomi's face was calm. "I work here," she said. That answer made the applause louder. Isabella finally found her voice. "Enough," she snapped, stepping toward the center, heel clicking. She danced a decent routine. Let us not confuse a circus trick with art. Her gaze slammed into Naomi's. "You got lucky." Naomi met her eyes. "I listened," she said, "to the music." She let the next words rest, cool and even. "It helps." A thin line appeared at the corner of Isabella's mouth. Alexander set his glass down and took one step into the circle. The applause softened and then faded as the guests sensed a new center forming. He looked at Naomi for a long second, the chandeliers painting thin bands of light across his tuxedo. When he spoke, the words were measured. "Who taught you that timing?" Naomi held his gaze. "Practice," she said. He studied her, then lifted his chin toward the room. "She wins the floor," he said. The crowd answered with another surge of applause. Isabella flinched as if the noise had pushed her backward. Naomi did not move, did not flinch, did not smile. The air between her and Alexander felt strangely charged, as if the floor remembered something neither of them had said yet. He glanced once more at the glint of gold at her collar, a thought half-formed and dangerous, then looked away. "Reset the floor," he told the staff quietly. "We're not done." Naomi stepped out of the circle as the guests buzzed again, the sound different now, less cruel, more urgent. Questions followed her like shadows. She didn't answer any of them. She touched the edge of her collar for a breath and let her hand fall. Behind her, Isabella hissed to her friends, "Find out who she is." The red dresses nodded, faces pinched. Alexander watched Naomi cross the marble. The feeling at the base of his ribs, old, unwelcome, electric, refused to leave. He didn't know the truth yet. He already knew the past had re-entered the room. The applause had barely faded when Naomi turned to slip away from the center. She wanted nothing more than to return to the shadows where she belonged. Already the women in red whispered behind their jeweled hands. Already Isabella hissed, plotting her next strike. Naomi only wanted to vanish before their envy swallowed her whole. But fate had its own timing. As she moved, the strap of her plain uniform snagged against the crystal stem of a champagne glass left on a table. She felt the tug, then heard the faint metallic clink. A chain slid free from beneath her collar. A small golden locket tumbled forward, catching the light of the chandeliers as it swung into view. The flash was quick, but not quick enough. Alexander Cortez's eyes locked onto it. The applause collapsed into silence, as though the ballroom itself had drawn a sudden breath and held it. Naomi froze, one hand instinctively rising to tuck the necklace back beneath her apron. But Alexander had already stepped forward. The billionaire's voice cut through the hush, low but sharp. "Where did you get that?" Naomi's heart thudded. Her fingers closed around the locket protectively. "It's nothing," she murmured, already backing away. "Nothing?" Alexander's laugh was brittle. He advanced another step, his shoes loud against the marble. "That piece is not nothing. I know it. I gave it." He stopped himself, jaw tight. "Answer me." The guests stirred uneasily, whispering. Fernanda's friends in red exchanged quick glances. Isabella, sensing her moment, pounced. "Of course she has it," Isabella said loudly. "She probably stole it. What else would a maid do? Stumble into our world, snatch whatever shines, and then dare to parade herself on our floor." Gasps rippled across the circle. A few nodded, eager to restore the old order where Isabella reigned untouchable. Others hesitated, remembering the way Naomi had just commanded the room. Naomi's throat tightened. Her instinct screamed to deny everything, to vanish into the anonymity she had lived with for years. But the weight of Alexander's gaze held her in place. He took another step closer. His eyes, dark, searching, burning, were not those of a man looking at a stranger. They were eyes rifling through memory, piecing together fragments buried for decades. "That locket," he said again, softer now, almost to himself. "Engraved initials on the back." A murmur swept through the guests. Some craned their necks, desperate for a glimpse. Naomi clutched the chain tighter. "Please don't." "Helena Moray," Alexander whispered. The name struck the room like a dropped glass. Several older guests gasped audibly. Others glanced at each other with dawning recognition. Helena Moray, the prodigy, the legendary tango instructor who had vanished from Sao Paulo without explanation over 20 years ago. Her disappearance had been the subject of gossip columns, hushed speculation, even scandal. And now, in front of them, the maid with the perfect tango was wearing her locket. Isabella barked a laugh, shrill and defensive. "That's ridiculous. This woman is no one. She cleans floors. She smells of bleach. Do you expect us to believe she is some great lost dancer?" But the certainty in Alexander's expression silenced her. Naomi's lips trembled. For the first time that evening, she truly looked cornered. Her eyes darted around the ballroom, faces staring, hands pointing, whispers swelling like a storm. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm just Naomi. That's all I've ever been." Alexander shook his head slowly. "No, you were more. I remember you. You taught me when I was 20 before." He broke off, memory tightening his throat. His glass of champagne slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble. "Why are you here? Why did you disappear?" The audience was riveted. The elite of Sao Paulo, used to endless parties and hollow spectacles, suddenly found themselves witnesses to something raw, scandalous, irresistible. Mrs. Mercedes, Alexander's mother, who had sat silently near the back all evening, rose at last. Her cane clicked against the floor as she approached. "Enough, Alexander," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The girl owes you no explanations here, in front of these vultures." "Mother, you know her," Alexander said desperately. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me this isn't Helena Moray." The old woman's gaze lingered on Naomi, on her trembling hands, the defiance barely holding her upright, the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "No," Mrs. Mercedes said softly. "You are not wrong." The room erupted. Some gasped. Others whispered Helena's name. Isabella turned pale, fury blazing across her face as the attention slipped permanently from her grasp. The red dresses pressed close, scandal lighting their eyes. Naomi staggered back, the weight of 2 decades collapsing onto her shoulders. She had survived obscurity. She had endured mockery. But she had never expected to be unmasked like this, in the cruelest ballroom, under the brightest lights. "I can't," she whispered. "Not here." She turned to flee. But Alexander caught her wrist, not rough, not cruel, desperate. "You can't run again," he said, voice breaking. "Not this time." Naomi's eyes darted to his, wide with fear and something else, something dangerously close to recognition. The locket dangled between them, golden, undeniable. And the ballroom, filled with Sao Paulo's most powerful, leaned forward as one, hungry for the truth that had finally clawed its way back from the shadows. "Enough," said Mrs. Mercedes, her cane clicking once against the marble. The word carried farther than any shout. The murmurs flattened. The red dresses stilled. Even the chandeliers seemed to listen. Alexander's grip loosened on Naomi's wrist, but he didn't let go. His voice softened, hoarse. "Mother, tell me I'm wrong." Mrs. Mercedes stepped into the circle, small beside her son but immovable, like a pillar left when a palace falls. She looked at Naomi first, at the locket trembling in her hand, at the set of her jaw that refused to break, and nodded once, as if greeting someone long expected. "You're not wrong," she said. "But if we are to speak, we will speak plainly." A rustle rolled through the room. Phones lifted, then faltered under her gaze. She turned, scanning Sao Paulo's elite as if weighing their right to witness what came next. "Madam," Isabella began, recovering her poise, "with respect, this is a private matter." Mrs. Mercedes didn't raise her voice. "Child, you've mistaken a spotlight for authority." She tilted her chin. "Be quiet." Isabella's mouth snapped shut. Heat climbed her cheeks as the women in red looked anywhere but at her. Mrs. Mercedes faced Naomi again. "Do you want me to say it here?" she asked gently. "Or shall we go somewhere without wolves?" Naomi hesitated. The circle, the eyes, the glittering malice, she could feel them pressing in like a hand on her throat. But she also saw the head waiter at the edge of the crowd, hands clenched, a silver-haired woman blinking back tears, a young server nodding, just once, as if to lend her a sliver of courage. "Say it," Naomi whispered. "I'm done hiding." Alexander's breath caught. He let her wrist go, but stayed near, as if distance might erase her. Mrs. Mercedes touched Naomi's hand, warm and steady. "Then listen." She turned to the crowd. 22 years ago, my son was not a king." The trace of a smile touched her mouth. "He was a boy who hated suits, who skipped meetings to run to a studio with scuffed floors and a window that overlooked the city. He went there to dance." A murmur, curiosity, disbelief. Alexander stared at the locket as if it might answer for him. "In that studio," Mrs. Mercedes continued, "taught a young woman named Helena Moret. She was fierce in the way only discipline can make you, and gentle in the way only pain can refine. She taught him how to stand, how to listen, how to move in time with something larger than himself." Her eyes softened. "For the first time, my son was alive on purpose." Naomi swallowed. The locket warmed against her palm. "Your father found out," Alexander said, voice low, as if remembering and questioning at once. "Yes," Mrs. Mercedes said. "Your father found out. He believed legacy is a cage you lock from the outside. He had plans for you. Alliances to cement, a marriage to arrange, a company to inherit. He saw Helena not as a teacher but as a threat." She looked around the ballroom. "And men like him do not argue with threats. They erase them." The words landed like stones dropped into deep water. No one moved. "He sent men to Helena's studio," Mrs. Mercedes said, each syllable clean. "They broke locks and smashed mirrors. They emptied the small safe where she kept tuition payments. They placed their fingerprints where the police would find them, and they made sure the papers would print the story he wanted to tell." Naomi's fingers tightened over the locket. She remembered the sound of glass, the sour smell of fear, the way hands can shake so hard you can't fit a key into a door. "He offered money," Mrs. Mercedes went on. "He offered safety if she would leave quietly. Helena refused." Her gaze flicked to Alexander. She believed the boy she taught would choose a life, not just an inheritance. "Mother," Alexander said, his voice fraying. Why didn't we stop him?" "Because I was a coward," she said simply. The bluntness shocked the room more than any excuse could have. "I told myself I could not stand against him and keep this family from splintering. So I did the smallest brave thing I knew how to do." She drew a steady breath. "I kept records." Her hand slipped into the pocket of her jacket and came out with a slim leather folder. A ripple moved through the front row. "Copies," she said, as if anticipating the question. "The originals are safe." She tapped the folder. "Payments. Letters. A recording he never knew I made. Enough to make a lie walk backward through every newspaper in this city." Isabella found her tongue. "You expect us to believe." "I expect you to watch," Mrs. Mercedes said, turning the full weight of her eyes on Isabella until the younger woman flinched. She offered the folder to Naomi. Naomi didn't take it at first. Her fingers hovered, afraid the touch would set her life on fire again. Finally she slid the folder free. The leather was cool. The weight felt heavier than paper should. "You kept this," Naomi said softly, not quite a question. "I kept it because I knew one day the truth would require an accountant," Mrs. Mercedes replied. "Numbers obey even when men don't." A nervous laugh skittered and died at the back of the room. Alexander scraped a hand over his jaw, as if he could shave 20 years off with a single pass. "I would have chosen," he said, "to no one and to Naomi most of all. I would have." "You were 20, Mrs. Mercedes said. "He kept you busy hating the wrong things. By the time you noticed the studio was dark, it was already too late to be heroic." She eased the sting with a glance that held both apology and pride. "But it isn't too late now." Silence pooled, different than before. Not expectant. Possible. Naomi opened the folder with care. A photocopy of a receipt, an obscene sum to a name she recognized from that winter. A typed memo arranging a visit. A notarized affidavit from a man who had later disappeared from the city. Her eyes stung. She blinked hard. A phone clicked a picture. Alexander lifted his head. "No photographs," he said. "Not an order. A plea." Strangely it worked. Phones lowered, guilt pricked. Naomi shut the folder. When she looked up, her gaze was clear. "You could have brought this to me," she said to Mrs. Mercedes. "Years ago." "I could have," the older woman said. "I chose watching over acting. I will not dress it as virtue. I am trying to choose differently now." Naomi nodded once. It was not forgiveness. It was a place to stand. "Helena," Alexander said, then stopped, the name catching on the life she had survived since. He tried again. "Naomi." His jaw worked. "I'm sorry is not a currency worthy of what you lost. I can't pay it. I can only change what I am while I still have breath." The beat. Then another. From the second row, a man in an impeccable suit cleared his throat. "This is moving," he said, fishing for the tone that would keep him nearest the winning side. "But surely the maid, Miss Johnson, still took what wasn't hers. That locket." "I gave it to her," Alexander said, and the sentence shocked him as much as it silenced the room. He looked at the necklace, at the way it fit Naomi's throat like a circle finally closed. 22 years ago. After the first night I finished a sequence without losing the beat. I bought it from a street vendor with money I should have used for textbooks. I told her to keep the music where it couldn't be taken. Naomi's fingers loosened around the gold. Memory, like a ghost, touched her shoulder and moved on. Isabella stepped forward, last stand simmering in her eyes. "This is theater," she spat. "She's conned you all. You're humiliating yourself for a woman your cruelty couldn't break," Mrs. Mercedes said. "Leave, Miss Duarte." The command was so spare, so certain, that for a heartbeat Isabella didn't understand it. When she did, color flooded her face. She looked to Alexander. He didn't look back. The women in red drifted, the way fish do when a larger shadow crosses the water. Isabella's heels scraped the marble. The doors opened for her and swallowed the perfume she left behind. Mrs. Mercedes turned to the guests. "You came for a party," she said. "You found a reckoning." She gestured toward the benches along the wall. "Sit or go. But if you remain, understand, you are witnesses, not judges." Chairs slid. People sat. Others left, eyes down, the way people do when a mirror has been held too long. The room, smaller now, felt heavier and more honest. Naomi closed the locket over her pulse and drew a breath that reached the bottom of her ribs. "What do you want from me?" she asked, not to the crowd, not to the mother, only to the man who had watched her dance like someone recognizing a language he'd once spoken. "To do what you choose," Alexander said. "If you want the world to hear the truth, I will stand beside you. If you want silence, I will make as much of it around you as money can buy. If you want me to never say your name again, I will obey." "And the bet you made," Naomi said, voice flat, reminding him and everyone else of the cruelty that had started the night. "In front of all of them." He took the hit. "I will honor my word," he said. "On your terms, not my spectacle." The corners of Naomi's mouth didn't move, but something in her eyes did, some measure taken, some weight adjusted. She looked to Mrs. Mercedes. "You said numbers obey. Will the newspapers?" "They will if they want to keep their advertisers," Mrs. Mercedes said dryly. "And if they don't, the courts will." She nodded at the folder in Naomi's hands. "That's not a favor. That's proof." Naomi held the folder against her chest. The ballroom receded to the edges of her vision. The chandeliers, the marble, the faces, the night that had tried to decide who she was and had failed. "Then we speak," she said. "Not tonight. Not in your hall. In daylight. On record." "As you wish," Mrs. Mercedes said. Alexander exhaled, a sound like a man setting down a load he had carried wrong for years. The string quartet, forgotten in the corner, sat with instruments in their laps, unsure whether sound still belonged to the night. Naomi turned to go. She paused, then looked back over her shoulder at Alexander. "You asked who taught me timing," she said. "Pain did. And practice. And a woman who believed a boy could keep a beat." The hint of a smile flickered through his exhaustion. "I'll try to deserve that boy," he said. "Try quieter," Naomi replied, and stepped out of the circle. The room didn't breathe until the doors closed behind her. Then the whispers rose, not cruel now, but stunned, rearranging the story they'd bring home. At the center, Mrs. Mercedes rested both hands on her cane and looked at her son. "Tomorrow," she said, "we begin." Alexander nodded. Somewhere behind his ribs, a rhythm returned that he had not trusted in years. It sounded like a tango counted in truth. For a long heartbeat after the doors closed on Naomi, no one dared breathe. The ballroom, built to amplify music, laughter, deals, held only the weight of what had just been said. Then the sound came back in tatters. A whisper here. A scrape of a chair there. Shoes shifting. Champagne glasses set down too carefully. The red dresses clustered and unclustered like birds trying to decide where the wind was going. Alexander stood in the center with his mother beside him, the folder's absence somehow louder than the string quartet's silence. He looked as if someone had stolen a decade from his face and replaced it with something truer. Isabella Duarte was first to move. She stepped forward, chin high, voice bright with a thin, frantic gloss. "Well," she said, clapping her hands once, "that was a performance. Very moving. But it's still your birthday, Alex. Let's get the music back, yes? People came to celebrate. We can send a donation to whatever her name was and call it a night." No one applauded. The echo of her claps died in the rafters. Mrs. Mercedes tilted her head the inch that separates patience from command. "Miss Duarte," she said mildly, "kindly stop mistaking noise for leadership." Color rose high on Isabella's cheeks. She half turned to the crowd, searching for a friendly face, and found only the mirror of their calculation. The women in red were with her until they weren't, their smiles already learning a new angle. Alexander lifted a hand. The room stilled again as if the air had been trained. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice steady. "What you witnessed tonight was not an entertainment. It was a correction." He didn't look at Isabella. He didn't look at anyone in particular. He spoke like a man setting a bone. "I humiliated a member of my staff," he continued. "I weaponized a room full of power against a woman I paid to be invisible. I did it because I could. If you clapped, you did it because you could. If you stayed silent, you did it because it was convenient." A murmur slid through the edges, offense, discomfort, the faint itch of conscience. He did not let it swell. "I won't varnish it with, 'I had too much to drink,' or 'I got carried away.' Cruelty is not a cocktail. It's a choice. I made it. Tonight I will begin to unmake it." He let the sentence stand until the chandeliers seemed to hum in agreement. "As to the wager you heard," he said, and there was a flicker in the room, that tasteless little thrill of gossip trying to lift its head, "I will honor my word on her terms, not mine. If she wishes it void, it is void. If she wishes it public, it will be public. I will not turn a woman into a headline to rescue my reputation." Across the ring, 3 phones sank an inch lower. "And as to the truth you learned," he went on, "the documents my mother kept will go to counsel in the morning. To the police if necessary. To the press if useful. Not to bury anyone, but to exhume what was buried." He turned at last to the staff in black and white lined along the wall, the same uniforms Naomi wore, the same posture of practiced smallness. "Every broken glass is on me," he said. "Every hour tonight pay double. Anyone who mocked you in my name will never work an event I host again, on either side of the table." The head waiter swallowed hard and nodded once. Something like relief moved down the line in a wave so subtle it might have been mistaken for a draft. Alexander faced the guests. "If you stay," he said, "you stay as witnesses. If you go, you leave through those doors now. Either way, the party is over." The sentence clipped off. The choice hung. A few people moved at once, the kind who survive storms by arriving somewhere else before the thunder. Others drifted toward the exits more slowly, taking their discomfort with them like a coat they would complain about in the car. Some sat, as instructed, and simply watched, uncomfortable in a way that might turn to something braver by morning. Isabella didn't move. Her laugh came out too high. "You can't be serious," she said. "You cannot possibly be serious, Alex. You're going to throw away everything, for her? For a maid with a sob story and a piece of costume jewelry." "My name is Alexander," he said without turning. "Use it correctly." She blinked, missing the step. "Fine. Alexander. Enough theater. Your team will spin this. We'll say we supported a rising local artist. We'll tell the truth," he said. "The truth." Her voice sharpened. "Here's the truth, that woman played you. She had that dance ready. She had that locket ready. She had a life ready," he said. "Then people like my father unmade it. Tonight, I won't help you do the same." The red dresses shifted, recognizing a door closing by the sound it didn't make. Isabella set her jaw. "You're embarrassing yourself. And me. You did that yourself when you mocked a woman's work to feed an audience," Mrs. Mercedes said, turning the scalpel of her gentleness toward Isabella again. "Consider this my final intervention in your education." Isabella looked from mother to son and saw no harbor. Something hard and frightened flashed in her eyes. "Choose," she said, voice low and bright with fury. "Right now. Me or the maid? Our life or this charade?" Alexander finally looked at her. The past, his father's baritone, a boardroom's cold glass, 1,000 dinners where choosing wrong was dressed up as sophistication, stood behind his eyes and waited for the old reflex. He did not call for it. "This is not a triangle," he said. "It's a line. I'm stepping off it." For a second she didn't understand. Then she did. The color changed in her face again, this time draining. "You're breaking our engagement. In public." "I'm ending a mistake," he said. "In public because I made it in public." The sound that came from her was not quite a word. She reached for him and found an absence where his arm had always been. The women in red watched with the careful blankness of people auditioning for distance. Someone in the third row looked down, ashamed of the pleasure the scene was trying to buy from him. Isabella's hand trembled once. Then it stilled. She drew herself up in the old way, the way that had opened 100 doors and closed 100 conversations. "You'll regret this," she said. "All of you." "Possibly," Mrs. Mercedes said, and the kindness in it made the threat small. "But less than we'd regret not doing it." Isabella's mouth twisted. She turned on her heel. The doors took her in without ceremony. The smell of her perfume lingered like a footnote as they closed. A hush fell that wasn't about hurt or shock anymore. It was the quiet that comes when a machine stops and you can hear what your own pulse sounds like. Alexander nodded once to the DJ. The man, grateful to have a task that wasn't moral, killed what little background hum remained. The quartet stared at their instruments as if the wood had grown a conscience. From the back, a voice, older, male, inconveniently brave, rose. "Mr. Cortez." Alexander turned. The man stood with his hat in both hands, the posture of someone who remembered better rooms and worse nights. "I clapped," he said, words slow and clean. "I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. To her. To the staff. To you for being the kind of host a man like me thought he had to impress." No one laughed. A woman beside him reached out and touched his sleeve as if to steady a truth on its feet. Alexander inclined his head. "Thank you," he said. "Do better with me tomorrow." The man nodded and sat, hat still in his hands. Phones buzzed, muted, but not dead. Screens bloomed with messages faster than a rumor. Billionaire ends engagement at own party. Maid's Tango stuns Sao Paulo. Old scandal rises. Documents promised. Some captions were cruel, some breathless, a few precise. A city was choosing its story in real time. Alexander turned to the head waiter. "First aid kit," he said quietly. "The cut on her hand. Find out where she lives. Send a car to wait until she lets it leave." "Yes, sir." "And the staff?" Mrs. Mercedes murmured. "Home early with pay," Alexander said. He lifted his voice. "Thank you all. We are done here." People rose, not because they were dismissed, but because the room had turned into something they no longer knew how to inhabit. The doors sighed open, took in tuxedos and gowns in polite handfuls. Fragments of conversation drifted. A whispered apology to a server, a numbers man promising to call a journalist he trusted. The word, Helena, said the way a name changes when it returns to its owner. When the hall was nearly empty, Alexander walked to the edge of the dance floor. A dime-sized drop of dried blood sat where Naomi had first knelt, a small dark punctuation on all that marble. He crouched, eyes level with it, and for a moment he seemed to see two rooms at once, this one, and another with a scuffed wooden floor and a window full of late light. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Mercedes said again, softer now, as if saying grace. "We begin." He stood. "Tonight," he said, "I make the calls." He took out his phone and typed with the blunt decisiveness of a man who had finally learned the difference between speed and urgency. To legal, full review at 8. To truth, not varnish. To the foundation director he barely spoke to anymore. Clear the morning. To an old number he hadn't dialed since he chose the boardroom over the mirror. "Are you still teaching? I need a studio and a door that closes." The replies chimed, small bells in a deep church. He looked toward the doors Naomi had vanished through. The space they framed felt less like an exit and more like a path. Outside, the night pressed cool against the city. Somewhere, a bandoneon player finished a song he hadn't known he'd started when a maid stepped onto a floor and taught a room to count in truth. The night smelled like rain. Naomi walked fast with her head down, the city's heat still trapped between buildings, her shoes tapping an uneven rhythm along the cracked pavement. The ballroom's glare had fallen off her shoulders like a costume. What clung was the sound. Laughter turned to gasps, applause turning into that other silence. Her palm throbbed where glass had cut her. She pressed the edge of her apron into it and kept moving. Her building rose out of the dim like a tired ship. She pushed through the rusted door and climbed, passing a window where a television shouted the evening news and another where a baby cried itself back to sleep. On the landing she paused, just long enough to breathe, and then she was inside the small square of her apartment, air heavy with the day's heat, the single chair by the window waiting the way furniture waits for the person who always comes back. She sat and peeled the damp apron from her hand. The cut was shallow but angry, a raw line that pulsed with each heartbeat. She stared at it until the shine of fresh blood dulled. "Don't," she whispered to herself, though she didn't finish the sentence. "Don't cry. Don't think. Don't go back." The tears were faster than the command. One slid over her knuckles and vanished into the dried red. She opened the nightstand drawer and took out the thing she'd failed to keep hidden, a thin gold locket on a chain, its surface scuffed but the small engraved letters still clean beneath the lamplight. HM. The initials seemed louder now that someone else had said them out loud. Her thumb traced them as if they might blur under pressure. For a few beats she was standing in a different room, long mirrors gone foggy with breath, wooden floor worn smooth by effort, sun in the dust, a bandoneon's voice like a hand on her spine, and then the apartment returned, dim and square and real. She had not meant for the necklace to show. She had not meant for him to see. But the glint had been enough, and his eyes had been the eyes of a man who had once counted to 8 for a reason other than winning. The knock at the door startled her hard enough to jolt the chair. She stood, chain wound tight around her fingers, pulse climbing. No one came this late. She held her breath until the second knock came, softer. "Naomi." A familiar voice, low. "It's Carlos." She set the locket on the table and opened the door the width of the chain. Carlos, the head waiter, stood in the hall with a paper sack and an apology already in his eyes. He didn't lean in. He smelled like starch and sweat and a little champagne. "I brought this," he said, lifting the bag. "Bandages. Antiseptic." Mr. Kors, asked me to make sure you were seen too. Naomi's hand tightened on the door. I don't want anything from him. Carlos nodded once, as though he'd rehearsed both answers. He sent the staff home. Paid double. Said the broken glass was his. It was a different kind of night. He tried a small smile that didn't quite land. You looked like yourself out there. Out where? She said too quickly. I clean floors. You did something else tonight, he answered. He lifted the bag again. Please. At least let me leave this. She hesitated, then opened the door wider. He set the bag on the tiny table and stepped back to the threshold, careful not to put his eyes anywhere she hadn't offered. Don't be fooled, Naomi said, looking at the floor. Men like him don't change. They put on a better suit and call it growth. Maybe, Carlos said. Or maybe people do one right thing and then try to add to it. He shrugged, almost shy. I'm not a philosopher. I carry trays. Naomi wanted to say thank you and couldn't find the muscles. She nodded instead. Carlos touched 2 fingers to his brow in a half salute and left, his footsteps fading into the stairwell. She closed the door and sat again. The room's heat settled back over her. She pulled the kit from the bag, cleaned the cut with a hiss, wrapped it in gauze with the neat, efficient motions you learn when no one else is going to do it. In the cracked mirror over the sink, she caught a sideways self, lines at her mouth that hadn't been there before, a streak of gray threading her hair, eyes that hadn't forgotten how to hold fire when they needed to. On the table the locket waited, all bright edges and old weight. She picked it up and let it hang from her fingers, swinging once like a clock that refused to choose a time. She could leave it on the wood and walk away from it, from the folder, from the promises whispered in a room that had made a habit of confusing applause with absolution. She could move again, evaporate into some other quiet street, a different uniform, a different name that didn't sound like a stage cue. The problem was that her body had remembered. Inside that circle, with 1,000 cruel eyes trying to feed, she had felt the old thing click back into place, the count beneath the noise, the space you carve with breath, the discipline that turns heat into line. You can bury a life. You can't always bury what it taught your bones to do. She set the chain over her neck and the locket found the hollow where it had always rested. The cool of it steadied her. She thought of the folder in Mrs. Mercedes's hand, of numbers and letters arranged in a way even power would have to obey. She thought of Alexander's face when he saw the glint, shock first, then memory, then shame, and after that a shape she couldn't afford to name. The apartment's thin window rattled at the first drop. Rain began as a rumor and turned certain, drumming the street, lifting the smell of dust. A car hissed by below. Somewhere a dog barked once and reconsidered. Her phone lay dark and face down on the table. She flipped it over. Messages had already started to collect. One from a coworker that was just a string of exclamation points and a question she didn't open. One from an unknown number that she didn't need to read to recognize. A news alert with her employer's name and the word reckoning in a font it reserved for disasters and elections. She turned the screen off and let the apartment be quiet again. If the documents were real, and her hands knew they were without touching them, then daylight would bring microphones and lawyers and the kind of attention that finds the one person who has spent 2 decades learning to be no one. Truth would clean her name. Truth would move into her rooms and rearrange them without asking where she kept the cups. She stood and went to the sink, ran water until it came cool, and drank from her palm like a person who had come too far without stopping. The bandage on her hand bloomed a little pink at the edge and then calmed. The city's lights smeared in the rain like a watercolor trying to remember its own lines. She returned to the chair and sat with her hands in her lap. She let the locket rest against her skin and closed her eyes long enough to see the studio again, the one with the scuffed wood and a window full of late light. She saw a boy trying to keep a beat like it was a promise and a girl who believed he could. When she opened her eyes, the room hadn't changed, but she had chosen a corner in it to stand. Not running, not yet speaking. A held note, a breath before the step. Not tonight, she said to the locket, to the window, to the rain. In the morning. She slipped the chain back under her collar as if it were returning to its post. She turned off the lamp and lay down on the narrow bed, hands folded over the bandage so she wouldn't wake to blood on the sheet. The thunder rolled over the city and kept going. The apartment settled and ticked. Sleep didn't come quickly, but when it came it did not drag her backward. It held her in the doorway between two rooms, the one she had survived and the one she had not yet agreed to enter, and let her rest there, listening. Outside, São Paulo listened too. The storm walked its streets. And somewhere across town a man who had chosen wrong for a very long time dialed numbers that meant daylight and truth and a different kind of music. Dawn rinsed the city clean. The storm had moved on, leaving the streets slick and honest. In Mrs. Mercedes's kitchen the light came in low and pale, finding a leather folder in the center of a wooden table like an object under oath. Alexander stood with his sleeves rolled, hands braced on either side of the folder as if steadying a ship. He hadn't slept. His tuxedo jacket was gone. The bow tie lay like a question mark near the sink. His mother poured coffee and didn't ask if he wanted sugar. She knew when sweetness helped and when it lied. "We will not buy this," she said. "We won't," he answered. A soft knock. Marina Alves, counsel, hair pulled back, eyes that missed nothing, stepped in with a laptop under her arm. Behind her, To-Do from Pierre hovered with the alert brightness of a man trained to put out fires with perfume. Marina set down her bag. "You made news," she said, opening the laptop. "All of it." "I made a mess," Alexander said. "Let's decide how to clean it without burying anything under the rug." To-Do cleared his throat. "We can frame last night as an unfortunate misunderstanding, emphasize your immediate corrective actions, underline your long-standing philanthropy." "No," Mrs. Mercedes said, so gently it landed harder than a shout. Alexander didn't look away from To-Do. "The story is the truth. We tell it or we don't speak." To-Do glanced at Marina. "It's my job to advise." "And mine to keep you out of prison," Marina said, dry. She slid the folder toward herself. "May I?" Alexander nodded. She paged through copies, the payments, the memo arranging a visit, the affidavit, the receipt. At the bottom, a flash drive. "What's this?" "Audio," Mrs. Mercedes said. "He never noticed when I insisted on using the white phone by the kitchen. I told him I liked the way the receiver felt." Her mouth thinned. "I liked the way it remembered." Marina looked at the flash drive as if it might bite. "If this is what you say it is, we send certified copies to the Ministerio Público before lunch." She glanced at Alexander. "You will also prepare a statement that admits what you can admit without compromising the investigation. No passive voice. No flowers." "I'll write it," Alexander said. To-Do shifted, searching for a lane. "And we pair it with action. A pledge. A fund. Scholarships." "That's a purchase with better stationery," Mrs. Mercedes said. "Do not dress penance as a gala." Alexander put both palms flat on the table. "We don't announce anything for her. We don't even say her name unless she consents." He caught Marina's eye. "Legally?" "Correct," Marina said. "Her consent in writing. If she won't give it, we redact. We protect her as fiercely as we failed to before." "My mother says the numbers will make the papers obey," he said, and the flicker at one corner of Marina's mouth might have been a smile. "The numbers will help," she said. "And so will a journalist who remembers what the job is for." Alexander pulled his phone. "Lidisha Pava," he said. "Folha. She used to carve my deals into useful shapes. She won't let me off easy." "Good," Marina said. "Send her the documents after the prosecutor. Embargo until the office acknowledges receipt." "And Naomi?" Mrs. Mercedes asked. The sound of the name in daylight did something in the room. Alexander exhaled. "We ask for permission," he said. "We do not show up at her door with a camera. We send copies of whatever concerns her and give her a choice. Name or no name, voice or none, our counsel at her disposal or someone she chooses and we pay for." "On her terms," his mother said. "On her terms," he repeated. He typed a message to Carlos. "Please deliver a sealed envelope to Naomi. Contents to follow. Do not wait at the door. Do not ask anything. Just the envelope and this note. Your call decides how this proceeds. No press, no pressure. If you want counsel not from me, I'll pay and step back." Carlos's reply came in under a minute. "Yes, sir." Across town, Naomi woke to the sound of rainwater leaving the gutters in long, hollow gulps. Her phone lay face down on the table. The apartment smelled like wet stone and bandages. She lay still a moment, the locket warm at her throat, the cut on her hand pulsing lightly under the gauze, and then she sat up and let the morning in. When she turned the phone over, the screen bloomed with the city's hunger, missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, messages from coworkers with a dozen versions of "Are you okay?" and "I saw you" and "Is it true?" 2 voicemails from a reporter, one from a soft-voiced woman who said she was a producer and wanted to give you space to tell your story to millions. She powered it off without listening to any of them. She boiled water, poured it over coffee grounds like sand, and watched the dark bloom through the paper filter. On the counter, a plain envelope sat where Carlos had slid it through the slot before dawn. "Your terms," the note said in a flat hand that did not belong to Alexander but had his grammar. Inside were photocopies, headings she recognized from the night before, amounts that made her breath stall. At the bottom, a list of names she had learned to forget on purpose. She set the copies down and stared at the window until the city came back into focus. In the kitchen, Marina clicked play. A man's voice, heavy, a baritone that used to pass for authority, filled the room. "Do what is necessary. I want no more lessons." She has a way of making him forget what he owes. Another voice, smaller, eager. "Consider it done, senor." The file ended. The kitchen felt colder. Marina didn't move for a beat, then slipped the drive back into its sleeve. "That's not redemption," she said. "That's evidence." "What happens next?" Alexander asked. "I file," Marina said. "You post your statement. Specific. Names yourself, protects her. You turn off your comments and you don't read them anyway. Then you wait." "I'm terrible at waiting," he said. "Learn," she said. He opened a blank document and began to write. He didn't outsource the heat. He put the verbs close to the subject and let the subject be himself. "I humiliated. I used. I chose." He typed "I'm sorry" and then deleted it and wrote "I was wrong" instead. He put in a line about wages and safety and non-retaliation that looked like a policy because it would be won by afternoon. He didn't use Naomi's name. To-do read over his shoulder and didn't recognize the man who had paid his salary for 10 years. "If you post this," he said carefully, "you will lose friends who liked you better drunk." "Then we'll find out which ones were friends," Alexander said, and hit publish. Somewhere 1,000,000 screens refreshed. The post rose to the top of sites that had only ever carried his picture when he bought something bigger than the last thing he bought. He turned his phone face down and let it ring. At 11:30 a courier left the courthouse empty-handed. The prosecutor's office had stamped a receipt. Marina forwarded the docket number to an email thread where subject lines grew teeth. At noon, Lidisha replied to Alexander's note with a single sentence: "Send the materials. I will not use her name without her consent." At 12:15, the first talk show tried to make last night into a segment with 2 comedians and a choreographer. The choreographer refused, on air. Isabella posted a photograph taken 4 months ago at a gala, her smile the kind that had always been safe in magazines. The caption read, "Truth always wins." The comments turned under her in a rhythm she had never learned to hear. Brands she loved went quiet. One unfollowed her with the subtlety of a closed door. At 1, Alexander left his mother's apartment and drove himself, no driver, no entourage, to a part of the city his tires were still learning. He didn't park in front of Naomi's building. He stopped 2 streets away and sat with the engine off until the heat began to leave the car. He wrote a note in his own hand on a small white card, "Daylight. On record. Your terms. If you prefer never to see me again, say so and I will do right far from your shadow." He signed only his first name and tucked the card into an envelope with a clean copy of his statement. He handed it to a boy selling gum at the corner and said, "For the lady in 3B. No tip from me unless she says it's welcome." The boy looked at him like he recognized him and like he didn't, then jogged away. Upstairs, Naomi stood with the envelope open on the table and the locket cold against her pulse. She read the card twice. Then she pulled another scrap of paper from the envelope, 2 phone numbers in a different hand, Marina Alves and a name she hadn't expected. Lidisha Pava. She turned the card over and found a line in her own old handwriting she didn't remember giving him. Do not rush the beat. Let it come to you. The paper smelled faintly like a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. She set it down carefully, as if her hand were heavy. She plugged the phone in, waited for it to wake, and scrolled past the hunger to the number that offered no applause. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Pava, said a voice that sounded like clean paper. I will speak, Naomi said. But not in his studio. Not in his hall. Come to my street without a camera. Bring a recorder and a pair of shoes you can stand in for a long time. A brief pause. I can do that, Letitia said. And one more thing, Naomi said. She looked at the locket, at the rain drying to a new skin on the window. We use my name when I say it, not a minute before. Understood. They set a time, afternoon, when the light would be honest and the traffic would keep people moving around them instead of stopping to stare. Naomi hung up and breathed. The apartment didn't feel larger, but it felt less like a cage and more like a room with a door she had found the key to. Down the block, Alexander watched a boy in a striped shirt climb the steps and ring a bell. He didn't wait to see the envelope disappear. He started the car and pulled away, the city making space for him without asking whether he deserved it. At the kitchen table, Mrs. Mercedes folded her hands over her cane and closed her eyes. The old phone in the hall, white, heavy, honest, sat in its cradle, ready to remember something better. Across Sao Paulo the day squared its shoulders. The story people had agreed to believe about a vanished dancer began to unwind under the weight of names, dates, receipts, and one woman's decision to speak on her own terms. The bandoneon, somewhere, found the breath between 2 notes and held it, waiting for the step that would come next because it had been chosen. The afternoon sun slanted low across Naomi Street, making the cobblestones glow like bronze. The neighborhood was noisy as usual, children chasing a ball, vendors calling prices, buses groaning at the corner, but Naomi felt as though the air had thinned. She sat on a simple wooden bench outside her building, a recorder on the stone ledge between her and the journalist who had come without entourage, without camera, without pretense. Letitia Pava wore a plain blazer and sneakers, exactly as Naomi had asked. She didn't smile too wide, didn't push with questions before Naomi was ready. She simply placed the recorder down and said, "When you're ready, we can begin. This is your tempo." Naomi touched the golden locket at her throat, the one that had betrayed her identity at the party. She could feel the sweat at her palm, the slight tremor in her breath. For 22 years, silence had been her armor. Now, words were her only weapon. I was once a teacher, she began softly, her eyes fixed on the children playing down the street. I taught tango. Not for money, but because it was what my soul demanded. And once, a boy came to my studio, arrogant, restless, burning with questions. His name was Alexander Mendonça. The recorder hummed quietly, capturing every syllable. Naomi spoke of the studio, of nights filled with music and youth, of the first spark of recognition between her and Alexander when he was just a young man with dreams. She painted the picture carefully, without melodrama, without self-pity. Then her voice hardened. And then, she said, the world decided a maid should know her place. Or perhaps it was not the world, but one man, his father. She described the false accusations, the staged robbery, the whispers that turned into headlines. She told of the morning she opened a newspaper and found her own name beside words like corrupt aura and ladra. The humiliation of neighbors looking away, of students vanishing overnight, of locks changed on the studio door. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to continue. I didn't steal. I didn't seduce. I didn't destroy. But the accusation was louder than any truth I had. She paused. A child's laughter rang across the street. Naomi swallowed. I ran, she said. Not because I was guilty, but because no one wanted my innocence. I washed dishes, scrubbed floors, carried trays. I became invisible, because invisibility was safer than being seen as a liar. Letitia didn't interrupt. She simply let the silence stretch until Naomi filled it again. But last night, Naomi said, her voice steadier now, in that ballroom, I remembered who I was. I danced, and the music remembered me. And so did he. The recorder clicked softly as Letitia ended the first file. Naomi, she said carefully, do you want your name on this story? Or do you want me to use another? Naomi closed her eyes. For years she had avoided her own name, as though it were a crime in itself. But hiding had cost her too much. My name is Naomi Moray, she said firmly. Write it. I am not a ghost. Across the city, the first lines of Letitia's article began to form. She was accused, condemned, erased. Now she speaks. And she dances again. That night the piece went live. Not a tabloid exposé, not a social media clip, but a full article on the front page of Folha. It detailed the evidence Mrs. Mercedes had preserved, the recordings, the receipts. But at its heart was Naomi's voice, clear, dignified, unbroken. Within minutes, the story spread like fire. Twitter threads multiplied, hashtags bloomed. Hashtag justice for Naomi, hashtag truth in Tango, hashtag Scandal. Some praised her courage. Others, predictably, sneered. She's after money. She wants revenge. She's a maid, what credibility does she have? Naomi turned off her phone after reading only a handful. But she knew the words were out there, and this time they could not be silenced. At the Mendonça offices, Alexander read the article twice, each line carving both guilt and pride into his chest. He knew the storm was only beginning, shareholders, board members, society friends all demanding answers, but for the first time, he didn't fear the storm. He welcomed it. Meanwhile, Isabella scrolled furiously on her tablet, watching her follower count bleed away. Contracts she had boasted about the week before were quietly postponed. The empire she had built on curated images was crumbling under the weight of Naomi's truth. But Naomi herself felt none of that. She was at home, in her small apartment, staring at the locket and breathing deeply. For the first time in decades, she had spoken without trembling. For the first time in decades, the world had heard her real voice. And somewhere in the city, Alexander whispered to himself, now the real dance begins. By morning the story had learned how to walk without help. It crossed breakfast tables, office group chats, and the back seats of rideshares. It slipped through revolving doors into glass towers where men pretended not to read headlines while they waited for elevators. Alexander watched it move from the corner of a boardroom that had never felt so small. The directors came in polished and wary. Some offered careful sympathy, others wore the particular patience of men who know their pens can outlast a news cycle. The chairman cleared his throat and said things like fiduciary duty and reputational risk and containment. I'm not interested in containing the truth, Alexander said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, lighter even with what it carried. I'm interested in repairing what we broke. What your father broke, one director corrected, relief slipping into blame. The sins of the previous administration. I'm not a new administration, Alexander said. I'm his son. I used his habits like furniture. Don't waste our time laundering it. He pushed a document across the table. Independent audit, public report. A credible firm, not one of our friends. We post whatever they find. A silence followed, the kind that measures money in lost lunches. Someone muttered about stock, about analysts, about how sincerity didn't index well. Alexander let the noise pass. I'm also establishing a fund, he said, dedicated to arts access for low-income communities, with governance that does not include me. The seed money comes from my dividends, not the company's balance sheet. It's not a tax write-off. It's restitution. Call it anything but that, PR advised from the wall, pale. Lawyers will. My lawyer will file whatever makes it legal and keeps it honest, Alexander said. The rest of you can decide if you want to stay on a board that knows how to spell its own name in daylight. He adjourned before anyone could ask for a compromise dressed as a strategy. In the hall, messages stacked. Journalists with questions that sounded like traps because they were donors who hoped this would pass, old acquaintances who didn't like how the mirror felt and wanted a softer glass. He ignored them all and drove to a neighborhood his car hadn't memorized yet. The community school sat in a converted warehouse with a roof that looked like it had opinions about rain. Children spilled out of a side door, laughing, faces bright with the kind of joy that doesn't wait for permission. From the open bay you could hear a speaker crackle, then a teacher's palm clap time, then the sound of feet finding it. He didn't step inside at first. He stood just off the doorway and watched Naomi teach. She wore a simple skirt and a plain top. The bandage on her hand had begun to loosen at the corner. Around her, a semicircle of teenagers mirrored her stance, too cool to commit until they forgot to be. Naomi counted soft enough that it made you lean in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. She corrected posture with 2 fingers on a shoulder blade, a palm hovering near a sternum, a nod when someone dared to lift their chin and carry it. She saw him after a few minutes and did not stop. She finished the sequence, let the kids hold it, then sent them for water with a clapping rhythm that had them laughing as they obeyed. "You shouldn't be here," she said when she reached him, not unkindly, not surprised. "I brought nothing with me," he said. "No cameras. No statements. Just a question and a draft of a better one." "The children need the floor," she said, glancing past him. "If you came to apologize again, you'll do it while untangling the extension cords and fixing that fan that groans like a dying animal." He found a screwdriver and climbed the ladder. The fan, obstinate, gave up its complaint after the 3rd try. The cords submitted to hands that had always been more patient with machines than with people. When he came down, sweat beading at his temple, she handed him a paper cup of water. He drank like a man who'd found the right use for thirst. "I read the article," he said. "You chose daylight and kept something for yourself. Thank you for both." She shrugged, a movement that tried to be casual and failed because of its weight. "I told enough to stop a stranger from writing the rest." He nodded. "And now I have a proposal to make. Not charity. Not penance with a ribbon. A partnership." The kids were drifting back in, slouching until the music would lift their spines again. Naomi looked at them the way a captain looks at weather. Then she looked at him. "Speak." "I found an old dance school in the center," he said. "Built in the 50s, bones still good. It needs work. It needs someone to decide what it becomes. I'll purchase the building and transfer ownership to a trust insulated from me and my company. The trust board will have 9 seats. 3 chosen by you, 3 by the community, 2 by independent educators we both respect, and 1 reserved for whoever sweeps the floor and knows when we're lying." She almost smiled. "That last seat will be the only one that matters." "Then it will matter," he said. "Half the class is free always. The other half scaled by income. Paid classes subsidize free ones. Scholarships are automatic for students who need them. No essays about how grateful they are. Teachers hired at a living wage with benefits. You as artistic director, with contract and autonomy. Transparent finances, audited yearly and posted on a bulletin board you can hit with your palm if they ever look pretty instead of clear. My money starts it. Your name, if you want it, builds it. If you don't want your name on the door, it will not be." "And what do you get?" she asked. "The chance to do something that keeps happening when I'm dead," he said. "And a room I can visit when I forget what the count feels like." He waited. The kids were stretching. A boy was showing off. The speaker hiccuped back to life. Naomi watched her class, then the broken ceiling tile she kept meaning to fix, then the man who had turned a ballroom into a trial and chosen the wrong side before finding a way to cross the floor. "If I say yes," she said, "we do this with paper that can survive a fire. A contract that can't be mistaken for gratitude. The trust's bylaws include language about who gets locked out when they try to buy in later. Community seats are real, not ceremonial. We pay for shoes and bus passes before we name any studios after anyone. The building has an elevator. The bathrooms have locks that don't stick. The lobby has a bench for grandmothers. And there's a fund for when somebody's lights get cut and you don't ask them to explain. Yes to all," he said without theatrics. "And a line that says the day you decide I'm in the way, I'm out. No speech, no plaque. Just gone." She studied him, as if cataloging who he had been last night and who he was trying to be this morning. "And press?" "None until you say so," he answered. "And then only what you invite. If the board wants a ribbon cutting, They can cut it in the storage closet. The corner of her mouth lifted, then flattened again. There's security. Since the story broke, I've had messages from people who were part of the old lie and wanted to stay comfortable. I won't be brave for free. I've already asked Marina to arrange protection, he said. Not men with sunglasses. People who know how to stand where a shadow used to be. The class began again. Naomi called counts that turned the room into a single, moving idea. Alexander stood at the edge and tried not to interrupt the air. When a small girl in the back hesitated, Naomi knelt to eye level and spoke softly, and the hesitation relaxed into a smile so fast it felt like sleight of hand. During a water break, Naomi said, "Show me the building." He drove her downtown in a car that smelled like coffee and paper. The space stood on a block that had seen better days and wanted them back. High windows, brick that remembered hands, a door with a stubborn hinge. Inside, dust rose in soft ghosts where sunlight cut through. A row of old bars lined one wall. A warped mirror leaned against another. You could hear the hollow of the floor if you stamped. Naomi walked to the center and pressed her palm to the wood. For a moment she closed her eyes. When she opened them, the room looked changed only because she had decided something in it. "This will need work," she said. "Yes," he said. "We'll lose money for years." "Yes. You'll be blamed for building a monument to your guilt." "I've been blamed for worse monuments," he said. "And for better reasons." She turned slowly, mapping the future. Lockers that didn't slam like doors closing forever, a small office with a glass window so children could see where decisions were made, a wall for flyers that advertised things people could actually afford. She tapped the floor with the toe of her shoe, listening to the seam. "The sprung floor has to be redone," she said. "I won't teach on something that punishes knees." "Then we redo it," he said. "With the craftsman you choose." She looked at him across the length of the room. "On paper first," she said. "Signatures before paint." "Of course," he said. "And we don't call it salvation," she added. "We call it work." He nodded. Something like relief crossed his face. Not the escape kind, the arrival kind. They stood there a while, neither of them speaking, both listening to the room imagine itself. When they left, the door stuck and then yielded with a sound like a laugh. On the sidewalk the city moved around them, indifferent and generous the way cities are when you give them something they can use. "Thank you for fixing the fan," she said. "Thank you for fixing the floor," he answered. "I haven't yet," she said. "You will," he said, as if he were remembering, not predicting. They walked to the car without touching, without promising anything that paper couldn't hold. Behind them, light fell through dusty windows onto wood that would be sanded smooth, then sealed, then danced on until it forgot it had ever been bare. The old warehouse no longer smelled of dust. It smelled of polish, of fresh paint, of possibility. Strings of warm lights curled across the ceiling. A banner read, "Centro Cultural de Danza Livre." Guests filled every seat, children in crisp shirts, mothers in their Sunday best, businessmen curious, journalists alert. Naomi stood behind the curtain, palms trembling, though she had danced before hundreds. Tonight was different. Tonight was about truth reclaimed. The music began, por una cabeza. She stepped onto the gleaming floor. The crowd hushed. Each movement she made was deliberate, carved with memory and fire. Her skirt swept like a flame. Her body told the story of survival and triumph. When she finished, the hall erupted. People rose, clapping until their hands stung. Naomi bowed, her chest rising with tears unshed. Alexander walked onto the stage. No tuxedo arrogance, only a simple dark suit, his voice steady. "This center exists because of a woman who chose dignity over silence, who turned pain into art. Tonight I apologize, not just to Naomi, but to every soul ever belittled by my name. May these walls be proof that wealth finds its worth only when it serves others." The applause swelled again. But he raised a hand. His eyes sought Naomi's, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "Naomi," he said, voice thick. "I once mocked you before hundreds. Tonight, before hundreds, I want to honor you. Not as a maid, not as a victim, but as the strongest woman I have ever known. Will you marry me?" A gasp spread through the crowd. Naomi's lips parted, her heart pounding like the drums of a parade. She had sworn never again to trust his world. But here, surrounded by children whose futures had just widened, she saw his sincerity. She stepped forward. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." The hall erupted. Children cheered. Mrs. Mercedes wept openly. Alexander took Naomi's hand, kissing it gently. The lights above flared brighter, and in that moment the city seemed to lean in and listen. The billionaire scorned. The maid reborn. The tango redeemed.